How you doing, everybody? It's Tuesday the 20th of April 2010, and it's late on in the afternoon, and I just want to talk about a couple of things. I want to talk about, the first thing I want to talk about is about Ireland, about the National Treasury Management Agency. That's the body that raises money through issuance of bonds on the international market. And they had a big bond auction yesterday, and they've managed to raise 1.5 billion. And I just want to quote from an article from today's Irish Times that covers it, okay? Written by a lady called Ciara O'Brien, and I put the link up to it here, and you can have a wee read it, alright? And it tells you the National Treasury Management Agency raised 1.5 billion in a bond auction. But that's not the important issue. What's interesting is just the perception that's incited by another economist. And we've 3 stockbroking companies here in Ireland, and they're tiny by world standards, but by Irish standards be big. And they're first, I think the biggest one is Good Buddies, and then you have Davies, and then you have Bloxham's, okay? And this fella's called Alan McQuaid, and he's the Bloxham's chief economist. He says the following: with all the concerns about the Greek debt issue, Ireland continues to receive praise from its Eurozone partners for the decisive steps that it has taken to address its budgetary problems. This perception is not just shared by politicians, but by the market at large, and as a result, Irish government paper, i.e. the bonds, are now traded as a must-have within the peripheral Euroland market, said Bloxham's chief economist Alan McQuaid. So we've gone from, in a few months, from the second sickest man in Europe, now all of a sudden we're a must-have. We're the Gucci handbags, we're a must-have. And you go to the bottom of the article and you read this. He says, the indications are the National Treasury Management Agency will try and raise as much as possible in 2010 and pre-fund some of next year's expected funding requirements, which at this stage look like being about 22 billion, Mr. McQuaid said. So there we have it as official. What's happening is they're going to raise this year between 22 and 24 billion this year, and next year they're going to raise the same amount of money again, 22 to 24 billion. And at the end of this year, if we include the NAMA money, our state debt will be 152 billion. And next year, adding on this other 22 billion, it'll be 174 billion. And measured against the 2 parameters that normally these types of state national debt are set against, our GDP and gross national product, GNP, we find that in the case of GNP, it's not really, in Ireland's case, GDP is not really the figure it should be measured against, because we have large groups of multinational companies here, alright, and they're involved in the pharmaceutical and electronics area, and they're mainly Americans, and they repatriate a huge amount of our GDP every year out of this country, is taken directly out of this country and laundered offshore for their parent holding companies in America. Now, the amount varies every year, but generally speaking, from what the figures that we can find out, it's generally around about 20 to 25 billion. That's what it is. Sometimes it's more. So really, when we talk about gross domestic product for Ireland, we shouldn't be talking about that. We should be talking about our gross national product, because the gross national product is gross domestic product with that figure taken off. It's the proper figure, because it's the figure that we leave inside Ireland, the money that's here. It's a benefit to us as an Irish people, and benefit to us as and our government. So when you take what our national debt is going to be at the end of next year, which is 174 billion, against gross national product, it's going to be approximately 150%. It's going to be 1.5 times our gross national product. And I tell you, there are very few countries in the world that are like that. Very, very few. I must actually check that out and see what other countries. But you're talking about serious problems there. You're talking about major problems there, because to service that debt will cost between 7 and 8 billion every year, just to service that debt, just to pay the interest on that debt. Anyway, because they told you in the article the interest that they're having to pay, the interest is between 4 and 5%, so you can work it out. It's not rocket science, okay? and the NAMA money is less. I know the NAMA money is less, but we don't know the capital amount within the NAMA money we're going to be liable for. We don't know that. We could be liable for the whole debt. We don't know. Anyway, the bottom line, so rather than believing Mr. what's his name, Alan McQuaid, I prefer to believe the figures that I can throw at myself. The reality is we're still a very, very sick country, and no amount of selling bonds on the international market is going to convince me otherwise, or looking at international markets and seeing how they respond to our bond issuance. Anyway, next thing I want to talk about is I just want to talk about what went on in the lead up to this crash and this whole debacle that we find ourselves in. And what went on was a couple of things, but in the main there was really only one thing. And what happened was our sovereignty and the sovereignty of various countries throughout the Western world, but in particular here in Ireland, our sovereignty was compromised by a group of banks. That's what happened. And these group of banks, in particular 3 of them, were able to go to our Minister of Finance and our Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, and put guns, metaphorical guns, to their head. And because the power, the financial power that they had, our Minister of Finance and our Taoiseach were not able to call their bluff. Imagine you're in a situation where you have a GDP of 168 billion, around that sort of figure, and you have a gross national product of around about 140 billion. Okay? And the top 3 banks, their total loan book is 420, in excess of 420 billion. That's what they had. Allied Irish Bank, Bank of Ireland and Anglo-Irish. Those 3 banks had a total loan book approaching, getting up to €500 billion. It was in excess of 420 billion euros. Almost 200 billion of it owed to one country, Germany. Alright? And when the crisis broke out, when the whole thing became obvious what was going to happen, and when the whole crash happened, what happened was those 3 banks went along and, as I say, metaphorically threatened our Taoiseach and this Brian Cowan fella and Brian Lenihan, and metaphorically said, if you don't bail us out, you don't go and borrow this money in Europe to help resolve, we'll pull a plug in this market. Watch what will happen to Ireland. And our Taoiseach, our leader, the leader of the man that we've given over our sovereignty to look after it for us and for our children and our grandchildren, for the future, he succumbed. He fell in, caved in. And so did Lenihan. He caved in. They never called the bank's bluff. They just caved in. And that happened because what has happened is our sovereignty has been usurped. We no longer have any sovereignty. Our sovereignty moved out of Ireland into Europe, and they have our sovereignty now. They tell us what to do. The likes of the Bilderbergers and these people, they tell us, the secret cabals that run international government, the banks and the super elite. Those banks represent their interests. They don't represent our interests. This is a conspiracy, an international conspiracy. It's nothing more, nothing less.